Hey, welcome back to the Kingsway Podcast.
Welcome.
Thanks for tuning in. I have our guest back, my brother, Tyler. What's up?
Hello.
It's good to see you again. And Ryan.
Yeah, I'm here,
Hello.
like always.
And we need to do a better job of introducing ourselves. My name is Trevor. I am one of the pastors here at Kingsway. Ryan is on staff.
Yep.
Tyler's in town, and I love to pick his brain. And I know you agree that it's fun to kind of have a different perspective and somebody that does love to learn and has been on his own journey. And I know that's been you to some degree for almost your whole life now.
Trying to learn.
Yeah, I'm trying.
So today I want to preface this before we get any further. Today's discussion is going to be intense. And not intense in the sense of like, I think you're going to be crying by the end of it or like that
Hopefully
it's going
you
to be.
will.
But intense in the sense that we're going to discuss the topic of hell today. And
Ooh, goody.
I know, yeah. And so
I was hoping it would be.
I want to preface this by saying we've all three grown up into the church, have faith from a young age. My brother and I grew up as pastors' kids and in non-denominational Christian churches in 3 different states, basically, and that has had its own effects and different positive and negative things that we've struggled with in our perspectives. And that being said, I think the journey through this question of what do you do with hell? What is hell? How do that type of things, and then what you were taught as a young Christian or as a child, and then what we're taught through media, and even as you mentioned, Far Side, before we started, and where we land. This can be one of the most difficult things to talk through. Even in our discussions before the podcast, there's moments where we're all trying to talk through some of these things, and it gets confusing or intense, or we're trying to communicate on the same level, see things from a different way. What I cannot promise you will happen today is that we are going to reinforce maybe what you were taught from a very young age, and that we are going to make you feel like you understand completely that original perspective. And I can't promise you that we are going to give the most holistic view of all the different perspectives in perfect simplicity or accuracy. What I can promise you, though, is we are three men that are pursuing Jesus, and we're trying to figure out this deep and difficult theological, I would say, topic, and we're doing so with grace and humility and trying to bring clarity and hope to it.
Yeah, I also want to say that, like, just kind of echoing what you said, this is a hard conversation with a lot of nuance. It feels like a surgeon in training practicing on a cadaver. What we're doing is intricate, but what we're messing with can be grotesque, can be very personal, can be... and so whatever toes we might step on that we're not trying to step on, they are in our pursuit to try to understand God and his world better.
And I think we're going to attach some links and some different things to this as well, that if you need to go further, you want more clarification. And even to say this, like anything we try to preach on a Sunday morning or teach from a large position of, in front of a crowd, we always try to do things that will unify the body and allow us to. We don't ever want to sugarcoat things or pretend like we don't believe things that are difficult, but we also know that there are certain conversations that need to happen in places like this, around a table, healthy discussions, and with humility. And I think that's what the goal of this is to say that we're all trying to learn some things. We're trying to move. The goal of this is not to crush one perspective or to smash down or to elevate one. The goal of this is to say, is this worth talking about? And at the center of this, is this something that can actually elevate our understanding of who God is and what he wants in his kingdom, what his kingdom really looks like?
Yeah. So when I was growing up, the little I was taught about hell was you don't want to go there. They'll prod you with spears forever, with no end, and there are only 2 options. There's either that or you think all roads lead to heaven. Is that what we're talking about today?
Yes. So let's just start this discussion by saying we all grew up in churches that I think propose this idea that hell is where the bad people go and heaven is where the good people go. Yeah. And the good people get to go to heaven and be with God forever, dress in white robes, and look like little angels.
And all play flutes and the guitar. And if you don't know one of those two, you got to learn it.
Yes.
The harp
You'll take
too,
your
of
first
course.
the harp.
Harp.
You'll take your first couple weeks in heaven learning those, and then you'll play
Forever.
until your fingers don't bleed because they can't.
And then the other side of it, and I really think it does, like there's a broad range of how hell was painted, but almost all include some sort of fire, some sort of place of torture, some sort of place of like, this is punish and pain. And a lot of times it was given kind of the timetable of forever.
Yeah.
So,
So I put up two very like weak and flimsy things that my little 6-year-old brain could understand whenever I don't know if it was 6 years old when I was taught some of that kind of stuff, but those were like the categories I had in my mind. And then I started looking into it this year and a little bit last year, and that's not generally the categories that Christians who have dug into this have. Generally, there's three.
yeah. Three main views, but
there's
there's a few.
So the one that Trevor said that we grew up with was the eternal conscious torment view.
Mm-hmm.
And it's exactly what it sounds like. Eternal, never-ending, conscious, you're feeling it, torment. Somebody is tormenting you.
You feel the weight of your mistakes. You feel the weight of your pain. You feel the weight of your shame.
And it never ends.
Mm-hmm.
Or even if it's not someone, like a being of some kind or a person or anything, kind of administering the pain, you're experiencing the pain.
Yeah, that's fair. I think that was me bringing it in from what I learned as a kid.
And like just to give you an idea of what even C.S. Lewis uses in The Great Divorce is he says you're given everything you wanted in this version of his hell, and it's everything you ever wanted with no one to share it with. And so even that, think of that side of it, where it's just like you get everything you wanted. There's no one to worry about. You're like you have no one to share it with. So you're just extremely
it's a
separate.
place where everyone moves farther and farther away from each other.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because their needs become something that they can't be around other people to get what they want. And so it separates and separates and separates, which is eternal torment.
Yeah.
But it's that version.
There's another view of hell called Annihilationism, or what was it? Conditional immortality, not conditional immorality.
No,
said that earlier. That's wrong. Where if you've chosen Jesus, you go to heaven, and if you have not chosen Jesus, the traditional view is you suffer for some amount of time.
Yep.
Could be a second, could be years. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And then you eventually cease to exist. The name Annihilationist sounds like you get squashed, but a lot of other people I've heard who espouse this view will just say you cease to exist.
Yep.
Like starving. At some point, like you just die.
The source of life is Christ or God or the Trinity, and as soon as you are cut off from them, your source of life is extinguished.
Yeah.
And so you cease to exist.
Either that like you're starving until you die, that kind of idea, that you're away from God and you just wither, or that you're serving a punishment for a certain amount of time and then you've served it and then you die. Those are kind of generally how annihilationists view it. And then there is universal reconciliation, which is that you will have infinite chances and opportunities even after your death to swear allegiance to Christ and actually do what most people on earth did to get into heaven in the other views.
Yeah, and that view has kind of different perspectives in the sense of like the torment that we would say is conscious in the first, or they would say is conscious in that view, actually has a purpose to bring about change. That the annihilation is actually the purifying, aspect of being made kind of more into the image that would be welcome to the kingdom of heaven, or that choice, and then ultimately giving the allegiance to Christ. And so,
what is killed is the old self, the old body, and the fire that is experienced is a refining fire.
A purifying fire. Rather than annihilating or causing pain and torment for eternity, it's actually purposeful and leads to everyone giving eternal chances to do that. Now, how long it takes and, all that.
That's all speculative at best.
So let's just say this, because the reason why I think this is important to talk about is that I think a lot of people don't recognize that all three of these views have been both like at the center of large movements of Christianity, and have been believed and have been kind of verified at different points in times of church history.
And no matter what you want to say to support yours, all three of these have some pretty good biblical support.
Yep. And I was going to say, it's really scary to say that sometimes because especially when you grew up in the Midwest, or if you grew up in traditional churches like myself, if I had looked at my youth pastor when I was like 13 and I was like, I'm a Christian Universalist, they would have been like, well, you and Oprah. Or
I think you mean you're not a Christian.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's not what the Bible says, right? Like it really would have been almost like heresy to even speculate that. But I think why I think it's important to have why I think it's cool that we're doing this and all three of us are here is I think all three of us have been on a little bit of a journey when we get to college and you start to open up some things or you read some different perspectives. All of a sudden you're going like, okay, maybe there's more to this, even biblically and discussion-wise and topic-wise to this. And that being said, I think, Tyler, you and I have had more discussions on this topic over the last 4 or 5 years, not trying to convince each other of either way, more just like saying like I'm investigating some of this stuff and I'm really finding it to be difficult to maintain maybe the traditional view that I was given, and I'm being swayed by evidence to kind of rethink. You know, hearing those three laid out, do you remember what it was like to be taught kind of that traditional eternal torment? Like what was it like when you started to read and investigate? Maybe that's not the view that you tend to lean towards this or lean toward today.
Yeah, I would say, well, first of all, that my views do not represent Kingsway Christian Church. Nor do they represent Tyler Coquillard in like any sort of final way, because this isn't like an end.
No, this is a narrative.
End place
this is a narrative.
Conclusion. It's all a process, and I think I just wanted to put that out there.
That's healthy because
for my own.
And I want to clarify too that I am in process as well.
Yeah.
And the reason why we're having this is I think there's a lot of people that are like that. And they need to have these discussions. It's healthy. Yeah.
To your question, which is what do I remember growing up with being taught? I think what you all were saying earlier both came to mind, which is there were popular representations that I sort of wove together between, I don't know, Disney cartoons where Donald Duck gets a anvil on the head and then he's flying up to heaven with a harp. And then between Far Side and Futurama or Simpsons or whatever.
Calvin and Hobbes.
Like there's plenty of it. Like there's something about the sort of clear binary thing that lends itself to like depiction, toward artistic imagination. Like it all runs on some energy that I think it seems like humans are just drawn toward in general, which also shows up in like good people and bad people, who's in and who's out, who's part of our tribe and who isn't, and how do we know who's safe and who isn't. All of those things sort of are all coming together in that. So there's the popular representations that sort of run on that. I think there's also that may or may not like have a theological agenda, but still sort of play with that imagery. Then you also, I remember like growing up in churches where I think pastors and people would talk about hell, but often I don't recall at this moment any pastor or preacher getting really sort of into the details of like what kind of tortures are waiting for you based on your sin or based on like relative to what you've done. This is what you are going to experience. I feel very fortunate not to have been in what are usually called like fire and brimstone settings, which is like is a lot of like meditating on the sort of pain of it and using a lot of what seems like fear-based tactics to elicit responses from people. I think there are times when that's done with good intentions and maybe times when they're not, but the result is that there's a lot of fear driving certain decisions. Now, if there's really a danger, then fear is the right response, of course. Of
course.
So it's not an inappropriate thing, but it's really different than like using the fear of being unfaithful as a reason to get married. Like that's not the same thing at all. Like that's like the fear of misusing your sexuality as like a reason you must get married. That's not the same thing as talking about the good of marriage and the good that's possible in like close, intimate, committed relationships. So growing up, I think I remember the sort of less of like the imagery and more of the stakes of what it meant for me, being somebody who knows the truth and knows the good, that my job is to help save people in this way, because the stakes are so high.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And so I think I remember, because I grew up as a Christian, it was less of like anxiety and more of like trying to like it's the driving thing behind all my motivation, which is like correcting other people or saving other people, which then shaped how I related to other people, including like whether or not I was able to listen long and well to perspectives that were different than mine, including other religions or other views, experiences, because the stakes were so high.
You didn't have time to listen.
There's
to all
no
that.
time to listen.
No, or to gain. And I agree. I want to make sure as we're talking through this, because why I'm saying I agree is because I lived with you growing up. So like some of the things you're saying, I'm not just like agree. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that because we were in the same church.
My dad never said that.
So like I'm like yeah, I do remember this. So I wanted to make sure I clarify that because people were like, why is he agreeing with him so much? It's about talking about his childhood. Like yeah, I was in the same church. I want to clarify too. Like this isn't like a thing that we're hopefully I don't want to come out of this bashing on one of these views completely. I think there's very biblical ways that people can hold these three perspectives in a godly, Christ-like way. But the language needs to reflect who I feel like the identity of who Jesus is, the identity of what you've talked about, the triune nature of this community of love that God is a part. And the way that I think in a negative factor that this eternal torment sometimes gets leveraged, that is sad to see, is this fear-based mentality where they leverage this like eternal thing that's going to hurt for like a really long time, and that somehow that this fire is never going to go out and they're just going to sit there and burn forever in it. This Gehenna fire that sits out, this trash pit that never went out outside of Jerusalem that they're relating this to. And they use that as kind of this, like you said, scare you into heaven rather than inviting you into love.
Yeah. One of my biggest issues with it, and this is mostly personal experience right here, is I just lost what I was about to say. It was going to be so good. You were going to be floored,
gonna be so
crying.
I was moved at just the possibility.
Yeah. Let me see if I can think of it. One of my biggest issues with it was I lost it.
No, you're good. I mean, the thing that I've always found most frustrating is that when I talk to a student or I talk to a young adult and they would say, I got saved, and I'd be like, oh, cool. Like, why did you, feel the need, to respond? They're like, well, I didn't want to go to hell.
Yeah.
And you're like, that's the end of the sentence.
Yeah. Okay. This might be a John Piper quote. If it is, whatever. But getting scared out of hell into heaven, the biggest issue that comes up with that is you get into heaven and God's there and you're like, who are you?
Yeah. You don't even know who he is.
So I think the John Piper quote is, if you think heaven will be great, even if God wasn't there, then you're not going to heaven, or something like that.
Yeah.
And the wording of that's whatever. But I think the point is a good point. And it's, watch the last episode we had with Tyler where I talk about the delighting in the Trinity, that book again. Yeah. If God is an eternal community of love, that's like total self-sacrificial love toward everybody else in this little Trinitarian group, and he's inviting us into that in heaven, then scaring people out of hell into heaven doesn't make any sense.
No.
Because the whole point is to be with God. If there was nothing in heaven but God, would you be okay with that?
Yeah.
Not even harps or flutes or whatever.
Not a single harp.
No harp anywhere. That's my biggest draw to heaven. But
so let me ask this then, because like what got me on my journey to ask deeper questions about this topic was that.
Yeah.
When I started to look at this, I just went, this seems like a really bad, poor understanding of this ultimate thing that's going to happen. If the relationship that Jesus is exposing with his disciples and that God is revealing himself fully, as the Bible says, in Christ, is that, why does that feel so far from what most people are experiencing when they're running from hell? Like they're running from this torment. Why does that seem to be the last thing they're experiencing?
Yeah.
Is this relationship aspect. Like the last thing they're experiencing seems to be. And I mean, yeah.
The other side of that, the thing that really pushed me over the edge was when I was in Bible college. No, I'm not going to say that. When I was in Bible college and I finally read Revelation 20 for the first time. And that's the part where God throws Satan into the lake of burning sulfur. And I was like, who's in charge of hell now? That was my first question.
Wait a minute.
There's only one powerful being who would, but like if that was the purpose of hell, to torment people forever.
Yeah.
Satan obviously isn't the king of hell. Who does that leave left?
Yeah.
And the picture I see of Jesus in the Gospels, I feel like is Jesus' character all the time.
It is.
Now that's Jesus without utilizing his divine power and whatever, and that's a longer discussion. But like, if I can't see Jesus as a king of love and inviting in the outsider and people who shouldn't be worthwhile according to cultural standards, I can't see that same Jesus tormenting people forever, devoting his hard-earned time to torture people forever. The end doesn't seem to match his character.
And it's definitely something that led me down the road to ask different questions. I mean, that was the second half of my question to you was like, so that's what you grew up with, or we, grew up with, but that was your perspective. Like what encouraged you to kind of maybe start the discussion of thinking differently or starting to go, okay, why do, maybe is this something worth investigating a little bit more?
It's a good question. I don't know if I recall a moment or if there was like you were saying, you were reading one passage in particular that sort of changed your mind. I think I read Rob Bell's book Love Wins, and then I read Francis Chan and Preston Sprinkle's book Erasing Hell, which was kind of a response one. And I know since then Preston Sprinkle has even sort of extended and kind of changed his own views from what was put in there.
Yep.
But I remember also reading Ben Witherington III, which is like if you're named that, you have to be a theologian, I think, or at least a scholar of some time.
Yeah.
I think you're legally obligated to do that.
Or born in the 14th century or something.
Right.
Or like the name of a dog that just looks really regal.
That's right, yeah.
Benjamin Witherington III.
That's right.
Eat your kibble.
If you please, yeah. He had a series of blog posts where he was walking through Rob Bell's book, and in those posts, he was the first one who sort of mentioned that there are these three strands of responses to the texts of the New Testament and the Old Testament as well, but explaining how to think about what's going on beyond, like what judgment sort of entails and means. And so he talks about eternal conscious torment. He talks about the annihilationist view, which I think he sort of advocated as a better interpretation than some of the things that Rob Bell was pointing towards in his book. And then he also pointed towards Christian universalism, saying that all three of them have been represented in it. And I think I think at that point, I don't know why, but I was already sort of like, well, it's probably not eternal conscious. That seems out of character. I think that had already happened, but I can't tell when or how. That's not like an argument on its own. It just means that if there's other ways of reading all of the same texts and like landing in a different place, that I was drawn toward a different one. So I think that was
kind of the first steps.
That was probably some of when my first exploring of it was. But actually before that, I'm remembering now, I had read N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope.
Oh, yeah.
And in that, he's talking much more about what exactly is the nature of the Christian hope? Like not like that unfaithfulness, but what is the good toward which everything is moving?
Yeah.
Like where is all of this going, and what kind of God has set it up to do that? Like what's that going to be like? So a vision of that good was like where I first started encountering a different way of contemplating this life, which included like redeeming matter itself, that like the physical body, that like all of these things, the physicality of the world, the beauty of the world, all of the goodness that we experience now is not some sort of like pit stop on the way to a disembodied future, but it's much, much more concrete what everything is headed toward. And if it's a new heavens, new earth, then there's a sort of new reality. If there's a new body, then there's a new physicality. That's all what it was pointing towards. And I think in that process is where I started going that way. Now, in the last 3 years, I probably read more and learned more about sort of historic Christian universalism than I did before. And so those are some of the perspectives that I've been kind of kicking around recently. But growing up and sort of this own process has not just been on this topic, but for me, like learning how small the slice of Christian thinking and experience was represented in some of the churches that I grew up in.
Yeah.
Like there are resources for the first 1,500 years of the church. We're all kind of drawing on the same people. Like there was just like we were all one. It was like one story for a real long time, for around a lot of stuff. Now Eastern Orthodox and like the church in the West split a little bit earlier and kind of parted ways earlier than that. But let's just say for the first 1,000 years of the church's life, there was just the one church, and some of these views are present there. And you just start to learn that there is a vast pool of resources and thinking on not just this topic, but many, many, many topics out there. And so this has been one sort of part of the process for me, which is like expanding the voices that I'm listening to.
And that's part of the reason why I want to invite you on, not this podcast, but the podcast before, because I do feel like that's kind of been your journey, is that expansion, is that like inviting in these voices and then allowing yourself to go like, hey, this was a limited perspective. There are other perspectives worth investigating and learning about, even if you don't fully give yourself to it, or but you're willing to sit with it and give it time.
You'll either fortify your own position or come up with a more fortified position. And all I mean by that is like more biblical, more reasonable, more whatever. Something stronger than my pastor taught me this, which is also like not a bad thing in itself.
No.
But this is something
both of y'all being pastors who teach people things.
That's what I was going to say.
Please listen to me.
Let me just
Everything
preface this by saying this is exactly what I wanted to happen. What I wanted to happen was not like, Ryan, you said, tell me all your evidence for what view you have. And like, Tyler, tell me all the evidence for what
who's right?
And like at the end, like, let the viewer decide, let the listener decide. Like, no, more of what I wanted to say was, if you're not willing to sit down and do some research and read a book and have a conversation and literally sift through some of the things that you've been taught or told, and you just decided without ever doing that, be careful. Be careful.
Yeah.
If you haven't taken the time to investigate some of this stuff, I can just say without a shadow of a doubt, you have not discovered this for yourself. You're just being told.
Yeah, that's doing as much work as voting in a local election and like coloring in the bubble for whoever has the funniest sounding name.
Yeah.
Which I haven't done that much.
Or just mimicking what the person did before you. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, it's just, in my mind, that's what opened this up for me. It wasn't, I started to see a little discrepancy, and then I started to change my perspective a little bit. And I read some views. And once I started to learn, like you said, and once I started to learn that there was not just one view that has kind of been at the center of this, but it's actually flip-flopped all three of those views in popularity through the centuries, where like one of them is elevated, one has been kind of pushed. And it wasn't until probably the last 400 years that like Eternal Conscious Torment rose to the top as kind of like the only one that's been kind of, seen as then, where there's there's large amounts of time that the others had more popularity. And, more promise, and I would say more confidence from people. And so, in my mind, my goal is not here to just sit here and squash one of these.
Yeah.
My goal is to say, like, when Tyler says he reads Rob Bell's book and then immediately reads the opposite view, like, I don't know
That's
if there's
what
a
we want.
healthier thing to do, like, than to read both sides of the coin and then go, like, okay,
does one of them
let
seem
me sit with this,
Yeah.
And what I loved about our conversations in private and in times when we talk about through this stuff is that I'll come into the conversation feeling very confident, feeling like I know it, and then he wouldn't even persuade me. Tyler wouldn't persuade me of anything. He would just quote like "Surprised by Hope" or quote Greg Boyd or quote some author that I'd never read before. This guy is from a Italian monastery and blah blah blah. And I'm like, okay, cool. What does he say? Then he's like this or like I've quoted it on here. He's like, yeah, this guy he's a Japanese kind of like a Japanese pastor and a rabbi teacher over there. And he says, God was fully capable of performing his will at 3 miles an hour for the 3 years that Jesus was on earth. So don't think that, you have to be, and I was like, it stuck with me forever. Like I was like, oh my goodness, that is the best quote I've ever heard.
3 Mile an Hour God is the name of his book.
See, and like I'm like, I stuck with me forever. Like I'm like, I can't get that out of my head.
Yeah.
And so why I think this discussion is worth it is because most of the time, and what's tragically happening, I think in the Midwest, is because this is eternal torment and conscious torment is the dominant view, is that people are walking away from the church and because of this at times, because they don't want to be scared anymore. And they're mad that this version of what is happening is not lining up with the Jesus that they're hearing about.
We try to preach to him a Jesus of love. And then if they ask, does he enjoy hurting people? You'll say, not yet.
But
later he will.
And it makes me sad. And I'm not trying to, go down on that. Like I said, I think there's some things that you can have perspective-wise that maybe haven't been handled well. But people don't sit with it and have a chance to have a conversation that brings some light. And then ultimately, I think, and this would be kind of the last thing I want to kind of enter discussion, because we could go into verses and all kinds of different things, but I don't know if that's really what I want to do in here. I don't know if I want to, throw the evidence. We have a couple resources that we'll put out. Erasing Hell's right here. I was just looking at it. It's, it's not a horrible book. Preston Sprinkle, the co-author with Francis Chan, put out a couple podcasts that explain all three of these views in a little more detail, and then actually goes into each of them. I think they're fantastic podcasts.
And that was after this book. So I think we'll link those and not the book. You can find the book if you want. But those are him after more research than when he did the book.
And there was slides and scripture references and kind of breaking down each. And I think he does a healthy job of laying out. But let me just ask this question to you. Like, what has been maybe the delight of kind of figuring out or sifting through these views that has been the fruit that has kind of come out of this? Maybe it's answered the question, or it's given you more confidence, or it's provided a perspective that's been a little different, or maybe it's just settled it and you're able to just kind of move on to other things. What has been kind of the thing as you've sifted through this? Or maybe you're still in a place of going like, I'm not sure, and you're just comfortable with where you're at. Well, where do you feel like maybe each of you you're at? And I can say my perspective too.
I think no matter where I'm at, for sure, the thing that I'm at is that pretty much what I said earlier, that John Piper kind of sounding quote, and that idea that if you're gonna end up with God in eternity, then you're probably gonna want to like being with God in eternity. I've talked about this a little bit, I think, on the podcast before. But I felt pretty lonely growing up at different times, and sometimes had a hard time making friends. And so the idea, the like scared into heaven idea, didn't sound that great to me. It just sounded like more loneliness. But now doing research on hell and on eternity and whatever, the idea that God is inviting us into eternity to be in community with him sounds incredible, because it sounds like meals I've had with friends, and sometimes during college with friends and their families, because they invited me over for Thanksgiving or for some break or something. Meals I've gotten to share with people looks a lot like eternity does, where the wedding banquet of the Lambs in Revelation chapter 19, but in chapter 22, there's the tree of life again. And the tree of life is not only the way that the beginning of Genesis describes, whether metaphorically or not, God communing with his people. It's also where they shared meals.
Yeah.
That the tree of life sustained them. And if it's there in eternity, it'll sustain us. And we won't just be immortal and ride our go-kart for 18 hours a day in heaven, but we'll be sustained by God for eternity. We'll be sustained by eating meals with God for eternity. That's been the most challenging thing to my previous view of heaven and hell.
Yeah.
Yeah. And communion.
I'm not sure there aren't go-karts.
I'm not saying there aren't.
They're new
I'm
ones,
just saying
though. They're
there's a
faster
lunch
for
break
sure.
in the middle.
Right.
They only go 3 miles an hour. The pace that Jesus...
Well, come on.
Oh, we need more than that. Jesus would have gone faster if he had a car. Let's be real, right?
That's pretty
probably
true.
the speed limit.
He would have hitchhiked.
If
He would have hitchhiked because he wouldn't have
we're
owned a
hanging
car.
out with the architect of the adrenaline glands, something tells me he'll be all right with it. Wingsuiting without the the death danger
man.
stuff or something.
Yeah.
Dude, I'll wingsuit there. Not here.
There's a few different things that I thought of as I've contemplated. Like for me, has been considering if universal reconciliation happens. The immediate questions for me were, I think, what happened for a lot of people, which is like, so everybody can just do bad things and it doesn't matter. Like you can just you can be that guy and then you just get away with it. How is that not like the rich getting everything they want, the evil getting everything they want? And then you start to sound like the Psalms, which are, the complaint Psalms, where it's like, how long they just get to, how long, O Lord? And then the Lord's like, forever. How about that? Like,
a day is 1,000 years and 1,000 years is a day.
This sounds like not like justice. This doesn't sound like people having to reckon with the deeds. But that's actually not what historic Christian universalism would advocate. They wouldn't advocate and say that there is no hell, but that it changes the purpose of it, and that the fire experienced is a refining fire, and because of that, every action will be judged. Like everything. Every person, I drive in New York City a lot. My wife will tell you some of my former coolness and calm behind the wheel has been rubbed off, has been depleted.
I've been on the phone with you.
One rush hour at a time. Incorporating regional gestures and things. Okay. But for me, there was one day actually where I was listening to a sermon by George MacDonald, who wrote fairy tales, and C.S. Lewis cites as an important influences in his own life. In one of George MacDonald actually subscribed to universal reconciliation, and he was talking about how everybody's going to be judged for this. And I'm listening to this driving. I drive like a delivery van or a full-size utility van, and I was pulled over on the side. And as I'm listening to it, I've been contemplating this stuff. I'm paused. I'm waiting for this job to start, and all of a sudden, whack! Something has hit my vehicle, and this UPS truck is like flies by. It's a postal service, like USPS truck goes flying by, and my left mirror has just been like, okay, what happened? The guy stops, get out of his truck, and like from like 50 feet away is like waves and like sorry, and then drives off. So I'm like, all right, but like, what are you gonna do? Like the mirrors, like it's just okay.
Dude,
I at that moment I did not have a lot of I was just contemplating that moment, because what MacDonald is talking about is that true reconciliation is not just between us and God, but it's between us and all things, and us and everybody else. And so the fruit of it for me has been contemplating all of those moments where I've mistreated, that in order to like full reconciliation with God to happen will be repentance and reconciliation with each person that I wronged, which if anybody's had, if you've ever, like we all do, have to really apologize for something when like the full like weight of what you did falls on you, and all you want to do is run and hide, but then you go and you repent and you apologize. There's forgiveness, there's reconciliation, there's embrace, the tears of repentance and reconciliation, that and the sort of intimacy that sort of is present there and comes from that. That is some serious pain, as well as a vision of beauty that is sort of, it has been challenging for me to contemplate. And so Paul's words like, every careless word you utter, or Jesus, like, everybody's gonna, like, your fruit is gonna be evaluated, or like everything is gonna be judged. Ironically, contemplating this perspective that like advocates that in one way or another, it's all going to come back together, and being like, well,
it's been more painful.
It's not, nothing matters. It's on the other side of like, holy cow, like that person's going to be there. And like, if that's the case, then maybe I want to try and set things right
so
here.
Hitler with a couple
and now.
million people would be tough.
I have no idea. I know a lot of people.
Like,
I know a lot of people are watching like The Chosen, and I know one of the recent things was like Jesus doing like a big receiving line, everybody coming, and like just like how long it takes to do that. But I don't know. Like this starts to strain the imagination of like what somebody who's done a lot of wrong that we would just sort of like offer as like an archetype of, or like this is the person who is like evil incarnate or something. Or just the person who was a bully to you in high school, or
who would you not want to forgive?
The person who's the source of your most painful traumatic things. Like how do you
my line would
think
be long.
about all of that?
My line would be long. Like I mean I'm not saying like but I'm like, I have enough things that I know I've done wrong that my line would be long. And it's, but at this, but that to me doesn't matter in that archetype when you start to talk about it.
Right.
Like how that looks, what that would look like. The relationship of even being restored to God would be similar, where you're like, how do we fully restore all the things that we've done?
We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled. Like, avoid the judgment that's coming. Like all of us will be like, again, it's weird. Like if you start embracing this, still the language of judgment even comes more readily, readily. It's still there. Like it's within an imaginative framework as well.
But it's an Isaiah 6 purifying hot coal.
What have I done? Who have I? How is it possible? How can I ever be healed unless
I'm
there's
a man
a tree?
of unclean lips. I need this. Now, why I found this really valuable, and I think it's really healthy that you said this at the very beginning. Like you're on a journey, you've been investigating this for years, and you and I have been talking about it in a really healthy way, and it has been, like you said, a more convicting view than I ever thought. Like it's not a view that when I think about, like if I take the word Christian off it and I just make it universalist, like where it's just like all roads to lead to this happy place in the sky, and like there's no Jesus that's a part of it, and it's just like you believe whatever you want. I have a huge struggle, but then you put this port of like, hey, this is something that God has in His power to do, to reconcile all things.
It's two things. One, you've said before. Should I incriminate you right now?
No,
you've
totally.
said before, and I think you're quoting other people. Every Christian should want to be a Christian universalist.
Everybody should want
to. You shouldn't. It's hard to be. No, it's impossible to be a mature Christian and at the same time say that person doesn't deserve Jesus. They're beyond hope. That person. Because, like, who are you to speak? Yeah. Jesus saved all of us from stuff that we can never save ourselves from, and that in ways that we didn't deserve. So everybody, just because of the call of Matthew 28, the Great Commission, should want to be a Christian universalist.
Yep.
Yeah. That's true.
There's no way around it.
And then the tens and I don't know if it's hundreds, but hundreds of passages that talk about Jesus saving all and the different ways you can understand that. We've already taken a lot of time, so I don't want to spend an hour on that.
I think that's important, and I want to give you a chance to say, like, I love the perspective that you just shared, and like how I think for the first time that people are listening to this may have never heard that presented that
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
where like they've never had a chance to understand this perspective. And I'm not trying to just lift that up as like the only valid one. I'm more just saying like there is validity in that. Like don't discount that view as something that's like complete heresy and way gone. Like, and I know you're not like ready to be like stand on the rock and be like, this is a for sure thing.
No.
And I'm not either, because I would say my view is similar. I have moved from eternal torment to annihilationist. That's my perspective. I stand there firmly, and I declare that. Now, for some of you that are listening, you're like, but you've been preaching for years, and I've never heard you say that. Yes, you're right. And if you're listening and you're watching on YouTube, that's because it has taken years of searching and looking and reading and
just
praying
weighing these different things against the scriptures.
Yes, and because it is a journey, and I can't promise I'll stay there. I can't promise that I won't go back to some of the. I can't promise that I will go a different direction. All I can tell you is, if you don't take the time to investigate, my relationship with God has grown. I have reasons behind this. This isn't made lightly. It's not something that I go, I want you to do.
It seems cool or fun or
it's honestly, it was hard. It was hard to talk to my dad about this.
Yeah.
It was hard to talk to some of my friends that go to Ozark Christian College about some of this. But I found people that were on the same path that it was very helpful for them to go, okay, let's start these questions. Let's have some of these discussions. What I'm never going to do is push my perspective in one of these three categories to the level to say that if you have a view in these three and you're doing it humbly and you're doing it with a learner's attitude, graciously seeking what you believe is the right perspective, I believe God's going to work with all three, and that probably you're going to learn some things by the time we get to heaven anyways by having all these defined. But I land on the view of that Jesus holds life in his hands and gets it through the Father and is absolutely binded together by the Holy Spirit. We talked about this last podcast with that, whatever you call that book now that you've quoted 45 times that I still can't.
Delighting in the Trinity.
Delighting in the Trinity.
Even I know it now.
Thank you. Your mind works better. But, there's certain things. I love what Mark Twain says. I'm going to say it until I'm blue in the face. It's not the things in the Bible that I don't understand that scares me. It's the things that I do.
Yeah.
And when we get to the place where we recognize that Jesus says you'll be known by your love and others will see you by that, I think then the defining characteristics or some of the values that maybe you want to go back and watch our podcast will be defined by this. Love is at the core of everything we do, because we're going to be known what we're for, not what we're against. And whatever your view is on hell, please be for people, because Jesus was.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Please be for people.
If I could say one more thing. I agree with all that. I think each one of these three that we've presented are ways of interpreting the same material.
Yeah.
All three perspectives are, and there's nuances between them, and like it's not, it's there's sliding scales. It's not like strict like division of things. Like it's just a little bit more complicated than just three camps. But for the sake of of simplicity
I agree.
here,
That's very healthy.
But everybody who has these perspectives, they're all reading the same Bible. They're all reading the same scriptures, and so it's really tempting. I've found that when you have one that you're persuaded of, it's tempting to assume that other people just haven't read these other texts. Like, well, you don't even know what it says in Matthew 24 about, like, you're not going to deal with, like, the sheep and the goats. Like, all three are trying to make sense of the same stuff. So a better approach is to try and investigate, well, this seems like an important text for me and what I understand. How do you read this text? How do you explain this? In your framework, what's the best way of approaching this? Now, you don't have to agree with what their answer is, but just assume there's an answer.
Yep.
Because that extends a level of generosity, of goodwill to people who are saying they're trying to follow Jesus. They're saying they're trying to understand things, and that you want extended to you across these differences.
That's the only way you're actually going to listen, too. That's the only way you're actually going to listen.
We're all interpreting. There's an interpretive move. It just to say this is what it means, that is an interpretation. And it doesn't mean it can just mean anything, but it does mean that there is an interpretive step in that process that we're all taking. And so that means we can be curious about other people's perspectives without fear. Because that's how it works.
Well, we need to
to
get better at doing this too. If we're truly going to follow Jesus and we're going to say the Bible has the power and influence, we need to get better at fully investigating it and not just putting our feet in the ground and pretending like we have it all figured out.
Yeah.
And inviting these other opinions and having conversations where, like you said, you extend like almost like the olive branch of hope of like, hey, let's actually have a conversation, not just like come in with your guns ready to shoot down every argument or thinking that they're ignorant and that they're not wise in their choices to believe what they believe.
Yeah.
I think that's a really, really healthy thing to do that we need to get better at.
And how you have those conversations is as important in my mind as like what you're saying. Like how you're expressing your faith is as important as like what kind of faith you're expressing, because that's that sort of fruit thing that Jesus talks about. Again, like if the way you go about living your faith does not involve gentleness, if it doesn't involve patience, if it doesn't involve peacefulness, like, then I'm not sure, then that's something worth investigating.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just like you mentioned in the book, that in the other podcast, like posture and like just the way of approaching some of these things goes such a long way when people are in pain. And I think when you're doing difficult discussions, your posture goes, and the way you approach things goes a long way in difficult subject matter as well. Yeah. And some of those things that extend actually create branches of agreement when you're both gentle and like common ground to be able to talk through things, logically.
Yeah.
I know for some of you, this has been a really intriguing and interesting podcast, and you might actually have some questions or some things. Yeah. Feel free to email us if you want clarification. Put a comment in there if you're like, oh wow, this has been really helpful. We are going to attach Preston Sprinkle's things, these 3 views in a little bit more detail, that you can go and listen to him talk about writing the book with Francis Chan and then investigating some of this stuff. We'll probably attach a few other things if you are interested. But a lot of this information, you guys, we're just touching the surface. This is more of a conversation between us to just say, hey, these are some of the ways that the subject of hell has been at some points oversimplified and then taught one way and kind of a very, very, I would say, a thin perspective. And so as we've grown in our faith and our journey and walk with Christ, we have definitely seen that opening up that perspective, asking good questions with humility and really looking at things has been really healthy for us. Yeah. And so I think this is hopefully a continued thing that you, the listener, can do as well. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Tyler. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Happy to be here.
And Ryan was awesome. Appreciate you.
I wore my red shirt for this topic too.
Did you?
I wore gray because there's a lot of gray.
I'm blue, so I'm right. I don't know. I'm
something
just
like that.
Kidding. All right. Peace and hope. That's what blue means anyways. Thanks so much for tuning in. Click the subscribe button if you enjoyed. You want to continue the conversation. Hit the like button and share it if you feel like someone might benefit from it. Yeah. And we'll see you guys on the next podcast. Have a great and glorious day in the Lord. We'll see you later.
See ya.
See ya.